Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I tried to contact my late father through a Ouija board. Now something is pretending to be him. I don't know how many times I've been told that the dead should stay dead, and that poking around the other side could open doors you can't close. But when grief wraps itself around you like a suffocating blanket, logic doesn't stand a chance. My dad passed away a year ago, unexpectedly. One day, he was fine, telling his corny dad jokes and waving at me from the porch. And the next, he was gone. A sudden heart attack, the doctors said. The hollow ache of that day never really went away. It just got buried under layers of pretending to be okay. It started with a bottle of whiskey and a nostalgic evening. I had been sorting through boxes of Dad's old stuff, Polaroids, letters, and a set of clunky tools that looked like they belonged in a museum, when I came across an old Ouija board, the kind that looked worn, edges frayed, the planchette a smooth wooden piece that felt oddly heavy in my hand. It was one of those things you'd laugh at during slumber parties as a kid, daring each other to summon ghosts while the glow of the flashlight cast weird shadows on your friends' faces. But that night, alone and aching, it felt different. It felt like a chance. I don't know what possessed me to set it up. Maybe it was the whiskey warming my blood, dulling the common sense that usually kept me away from things that could get weird. But there I was, sitting cross-legged on the worn carpet of my childhood room, candlelight flickering around me, and the board laid out like some silent, ancient invitation. Dad? My voice cracked in the quiet. I felt ridiculous, sitting there speaking to nothing but a wooden board and the shadows. But then the air shifted, or at least it felt like it did. You know, when you're in a room and someone walks in, and you can sense them even if they're quiet. That's what it felt like. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and my fingers went numb around the edges of the planchette. Nothing happened for what felt like forever. Just the creak of the old house settling around me, the distant hum of a passing car, and my heartbeat pounding so loud it felt like it echoed in the room. I was about to laugh at myself and pack the board away when the planchette moved. Just a nudge, a tiny tremble under my fingers. I froze, staring at it. My brain scrambled for rational answers. Maybe my hand twitched, or maybe there was a draft I hadn't noticed. But then it moved again, slow and deliberate. It slid over to H. I stared, my breath caught in my throat. It moved next. Then M.HIM. Is this Dad? I whispered. My voice sounded like someone else's, small, scared. The planchette hovered, then dragged itself to Y. I swear I felt the muscles in my arm tingle, like I wasn't in control. E, and then it slid to S. Yes. A rush of relief and something else. Hope, maybe? I'd like to think it was hope, washed over me. I smiled, tears pricking my eyes. Dad, I said, my throat thick. I miss you. The planchette started moving again, faster this time. NEVER. Then a pause. My pulse quickened. It continued. GOBACK. The candle's flame flickered violently, as if caught in a sudden gust, but the windows were shut tight. Never go back? The room felt smaller, pressing in around me. The comforting warmth was gone, replaced by a cold that seeped into my bones. My mouth went dry, and I couldn't move even if I wanted to. The shadows cast by the candle seemed longer, darker. I glanced at the corner of the room, and for just a second, I could have sworn I saw something shift, a sliver of movement just out of the light's reach. I wanted to believe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But the planchette twitched again and spelled one last word, HIM. The flame sputtered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. And then, in the pitch-black silence, I heard it, a whisper, so close it felt like someone's breath against my ear. "I'm here." I scrambled backward, knocking into the boxes and sending a cascade of old photos and trinkets to the floor. My heart thumped erratically as I fumbled for the switch, bathing the room in the unforgiving glare of the overhead light. But the room was empty. Still, that feeling of someone, something, being there lingered, watching from a place I couldn't see. And just before I turned to leave, my eyes caught a photo from the scattered pile on the floor. It was one I didn't remember taking, a snapshot of the room, empty except for the dark silhouette standing behind the spot where I had just been sitting. The night after that first encounter, sleep didn't come easy. I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the faint orange glow of the street lamp filtering through my curtains. Every creak of the house, every distant rustle of the trees outside made my skin crawl. The photo I found earlier, the one with the silhouette, sat face down on my dresser, hidden like it could somehow erase the memory of it. But the silence was the worst part. It was so thick, so heavy, that it felt like the room itself was waiting for something. I kept telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that grief and a bottle of whiskey were a dangerous combination. Yet, deep down, I knew that whatever had happened wasn't a hallucination. Around 3 a.m., the room grew colder, like a draft had slipped through the cracks, even though the windows were shut tight. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and tried to convince myself to close my eyes. That's when I heard it, the faint, rhythmic tap-tap-tap coming from downstairs. I froze, listening. It was soft but distinct, like fingernails drumming on wood. My breath hitched as it continued. A patient, deliberate sound that didn't stop. It was coming from the living room, where I'd left the Ouija board. Against every ounce of self-preservation screaming at me to stay in bed, I swung my legs over the side and stood up. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I winced at the noise, half expecting something to respond in the dark. My fingers found the small flashlight on my nightstand, and I clicked it on, the thin beam of light cutting through the shadows, like a lifeline. The hallway felt longer than usual, stretching into an unsettling gloom. As I passed the photos on the wall, the ones of family trips and Christmas mornings, I could have sworn the faces looked off. Not quite smiling, just staring. But I didn't stop to look closer. Reaching the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The tapping had stopped. Silence pooled around me again, and I wondered if going down there was the worst idea I'd ever had. But before I could turn back, a low creak came from the living room. The sound of the old rocking chair shifting on its own. Heart pounding. I took the steps one by one, the flashlight beam trembling in my grasp. The living room was bathed in the dim glow from the streetlight, filtering through the curtains. Everything seemed normal at first, but then I noticed it. The Ouija board, still laid out on the floor. The planchette had moved. It was positioned over a single word, H-E-L-P. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. I knelt down, eyes flicking around the room as if expecting something to jump out. The planchette felt cold as I touched it, colder than the night air around me. I pushed it to the center of the board and whispered, "Who are you?" For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then it began to move, slow and jerky, like whatever was guiding it struggled against some unseen force. My fingers barely brushed it, just enough to feel the drag beneath. N-O-T, it spelled, pausing before continuing. D-A-D. A chill ran down my spine so sharp I thought I'd been doused in ice water. The room seemed to close in on me, shadows pressing in from every corner. I stood up so fast that I nearly tripped over the edge of the rug, my pulse thundering in my ears. Just as I turned to leave, something scraped behind me. A long shuffling sound like fabric dragging across the floor. I spun around, flashlight shaking as I aimed it wildly. The rocking chair, the one that hadn't been used since Dad's passing, was moving back and forth in a slow, lazy arc. It creaked, a haunting lullaby that sent a bolt of terror through my chest. And then, over the creak, came a voice. Low, raspy, and unmistakably not my father's. "You let me in." I backed away until I hit the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room pulsed with an unnatural cold, and I felt that same suffocating sensation as before. That presence, closer now, unseen, but undeniable. And somewhere in the darkness, beneath the thrum of my heartbeat, I heard a faint, mocking laugh. I did the only thing I could think of. I bolted. Up the stairs, into my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I sat with my back pressed to it, flashlight clutched in my shaking hands, and listened as the rocking chair below came to a stop. But the laugh followed me, whispering through the crack under the door, trailing into silence only when dawn's light crept into the room. Daylight did little to dispel the gnawing dread that clung to me. The morning sun streaming through my curtains felt pale and weak, like it couldn't reach into the corners of my mind where the memory of last night still festered. I stayed in bed for hours, listening to the soft chirping of birds that sounded almost mocking, a stark contrast to the whispered laughter that had chased me into the small hours of dawn. When I finally gathered the nerve to go downstairs, the living room looked almost normal. Almost. The Ouija board was still on the floor, the planchette sitting perfectly still in the middle, as if it hadn't spelled out those chilling words the night before. The rocking chair, however, faced a different direction, angled slightly toward the hallway, like it had turned to watch me retreat. I shoved the board into an old box and pushed it to the back of the closet, hoping out of sight would mean out of mind. But as the day wore on, a sense of unease crawled over me, its grip tightening as evening approached. The laugh that had slithered under my door replayed in my head, a taunting echo that wouldn't fade. By the time the sky darkened, I felt trapped. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a cage. I tried to distract myself with TV, the mindless chatter of sitcoms filling the silence. But every so often, I'd hear something, a soft creak, a distant thump, and my heart would lurch. Around 9 p.m, my phone buzzed on the coffee table, the sharp sound making me jump. I glanced at the screen. A message from my friend, Julia. "Hey, how are you holding up? Haven't heard from you in a while." Typing a reply felt strange, like it anchored me to reality. I told her I was fine, just dealing with some weird stuff. She responded with a promise to come over soon, and for a moment, the idea of not being alone felt like a lifeline. The night stretched on, and with every hour, the house grew colder. The small lamp by the couch flickered once, then twice before going dark. I sat up, the room instantly feeling more hostile in the absence of that soft glow. The kitchen light was still on, casting a long beam that only made the living room shadows seem deeper. I stood, fighting the chill that crawled up my spine, and reached for the lamp's switch. The bulb was warm, but lifeless. "Come on," I muttered, stepping into the kitchen to flick the main switch. Nothing. The silence that followed was thick, pressing against my ears until I swore I could hear the faintest rustle, like fabric brushing against the wall. Then came the footsteps, soft, measured, like someone testing the creaky floorboards with bare feet. They came from the hallway, and I stood rooted in place, breath frozen in my lungs. The shadow at the edge of the kitchen seemed to shift, darkening, as if something was stepping into it. The temperature dropped again, and the sound of those steps grew louder, stopping just out of sight. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. Silence. And then, a knock. Just once. But it wasn't on the front door. It came from inside the hallway, as if someone was tapping on the wall. I backed away, my hand fumbling for my phone. The screen lit up, casting a small blue glow over the kitchen counter. I glanced at it out of instinct, and nearly dropped it when I saw the notification. A new photo had appeared in my gallery. My fingers trembled as I opened it. It was a shot of my living room, taken from behind the couch where I had been sitting moments before. In the corner of the frame, partially obscured by shadow, was the outline of a figure, tall, thin, and impossibly still. The face was blank, more like an absence of features than anything human, and yet felt like it was watching me. The phone slipped from my grip, clattering onto the counter. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a long, scraping sound. I spun around, eyes wide and searching. The hallway light flickered back to life for just a second, illuminating the empty space, but only just. For at the very edge, where the light failed, something shifted, disappearing into the dark. I backed up until my legs hit the counter, pulse hammering in my chest. The air seemed to vibrate with tension, the silence waiting to snap. And then, from the shadowed hall, came that same rasping voice, so close it felt like it was whispering from the next room. "You should never have called me." The kitchen light went out, plunging the room into blackness. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have. The morning light was pale and washed out, creeping through the kitchen window as if it were afraid to come inside. I sat slumped against the counter, the knife still on the floor beside me, glinting under the cold glow. My phone lay on the counter, dark and lifeless. The notification from the night before was gone, replaced by the usual blank lock screen. The silence felt different now, deeper, weighted with the echo of whatever had happened. I glanced at the living room, half expecting to see the rocking chair moving, but it stood as still as the grave. Everything felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. The dread in my chest hadn't eased. If anything, it had sharpened, honed to a fine point that pressed into me with every heartbeat. I couldn't stay in the house. The air inside felt tainted, heavy with something unseen and hostile. Grabbing my keys, I stumbled out the front door into the weak morning light. The street was quiet, empty, but somehow comforting in its normalcy. I breathed in the crisp air, trying to convince myself that whatever had happened was confined to the darkness, that it couldn't follow me into the day. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I spent the day driving aimlessly, the car's engine a dull hum that drowned out the pounding in my chest. I only stopped when the sun began to set, pulling into a diner on the outskirts of town. The neon sign buzzed overhead, flickering in a way that made my skin crawl. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and fried food grounded me, if only for a moment. I found a booth in the corner, far from the windows, and sat with my back to the wall. Julia's number stared up at me from my phone screen. I hadn't responded since last night, too scared to explain what I couldn't fully understand myself. I needed to talk to someone, to hear a voice that wasn't twisted and otherworldly. Before I could hit call, the bell above the diner's door chimed and a man walked in. He was tall, with dark hair and a worn leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days. There was nothing particularly unusual about him, except that as he passed, he glanced at me with eyes that were a shade too dark. like twin voids set into his face. He nodded once, almost as if he recognized me, and sat at the counter. My stomach twisted. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my frayed nerves seeing things that weren't there. But when he turned to look at me again, a chill ran down my spine. His eyes didn't reflect the light. They swallowed it. I dropped my gaze to the phone, fingers trembling as I finally pressed the call button. Julia picked up on the second ring, her voice bright with concern. "Hey, I've been worried. Are you okay?" "I don't know," I whispered, the words barely making it past the lump in my throat. "Something happened last night. I think I made a mistake." She was silent for a beat. "Where are you? I can come get you." Before I could answer, the man at the counter stood up. He didn't pay, didn't say a word, just stood and turned to face me, those bottomless eyes locking onto mine. My voice faltered, the phone slipping from my grasp and clattering onto the table. "No need," he said, though his lips never moved. The voice resonated in my head, the same rasping tone from the night before. "I'm already here." Time slowed. The lights in the diner dimmed, the hum of conversation fading to an unnatural stillness. The man took a step forward, and the room seemed to darken with his presence. Shadows crawled up the walls, pooling like ink around the edges of the room. I stumbled to my feet, knocking the chair over as I backed toward the kitchen door. The other patrons sat frozen, eyes glazed and mouths slightly open as if they were caught in some horrible pause. "Leave them," the voice said, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "This is between you and me." My back hit the swinging kitchen door, and I pushed through it, heart pounding like a trapped bird. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and sputtered, the sound crackling in my ears. I grabbed the back exit handle, wrenching it open just as the shadows coalesced in the doorway behind me, forming that tall, thin silhouette. "You let me in," it whispered, a smile in its voice. "And now, you'll never be alone. Again." The last thing I saw before darkness overtook me was those eyes, empty and endless, pulling me in like the gravity of a dying star. We asked the Ouija board, what happened to the previous homeowner? It spelled out, "I'm still here." A few months ago, my partner Jess and I finally made the big leap and moved into our first home. We were young, excited, and a bit too eager to prove we could manage on our own. The house itself was perfect. A modest 2-story place in an older neighborhood, the kind with cracked sidewalks and big, gnarled oak trees looming overhead. It had a little yard, squeaky floors, and an attic full of forgotten relics that probably belonged to whoever lived there before us. On the day we moved in, the air was heavy with the smell of fresh paint and old wood. Boxes were scattered everywhere, half opened, and spilling over with our mismatched furniture and second-hand decorations. Jess was in the kitchen, humming along to an upbeat playlist, while trying to organise our thrifted plates and chipped mugs. I was in the living room, wrestling with the world's most stubborn sofa cushion, when I noticed something odd. Tucked behind the old brick fireplace was a small, dusty box. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. My curiosity got the better of me, so I reached over, coughing as a cloud of dust puffed into my face. The box was lighter than expected. It rattled when I shook it, and for a split second, I considered just shoving it back where I found it. But of course that would have been too easy. "Hey Jess, come check this out," I called out, trying to sound more amused than unsettled. She peeked her head around the corner, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, eyes sparkling with that reckless curiosity that had gotten us both into trouble more times than I could count. "What is it?" she asked, wiping her hands on her jeans. I opened the box slowly, like I expected something to jump out. Inside was a Ouija board, old and yellowed, with faded lettering. It looked handmade, The wood warped at the corners and stained dark from what I hoped was just spilled wax or old varnish. Next to it was a planchette, cracked down the middle, but still usable. Jess grinned, eyes wide with mischief. "No way. That's so old school. Let's try it tonight." I hesitated. I'd heard all the stories, the warnings about the veil and the supposed spirits that hung around, bored out of their ethereal minds, waiting for someone to contact them. I wasn't superstitious, but I wasn't stupid either. "I don't know," I said, giving her a half smile. "Seems like a bad idea." Jess rolled her eyes. "Come on, it'll be fun. Besides, it's not like we're summoning anything." That night, after the sun had set and our new home was draped in that comfortable kind of silence, we sat cross-legged on the living room floor. A couple of candles flickered around us, their warm glow painting the walls in orange and shadow. The Ouija board lay between us, and I couldn't help but feel like we were staring at some kind of forbidden artifact. Jess took a deep breath and placed her fingers lightly on the planchette. I mirrored her, my palms already damp with nerves. "Okay," she whispered, almost giggling. "Is there anyone here with us?" For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was so deep, I could hear the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the occasional creak of the house settling, and the wind brushing the branches against the window. I glanced at Jess, ready to make a joke about how spooky it wasn't, but then the planchette twitched, just a little, but enough for both of us to suck in a breath. "Did you do that?" I asked, eyes wide. "No," she said, voice a little less confident now. The planchette shifted again, this time gliding across the board with an unnatural smoothness. My chest tightened as it stopped on the letter Y. Jess's fingers trembled, and I wanted to pull my hand away, but I couldn't move. "Oh, you. Are you here?" Jess whispered, and I couldn't tell if her voice was shaking from excitement or fear. The planchette darted across the board, landing on Y again. My stomach churned. This wasn't funny anymore. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded hollow to my own ears. The response came faster this time, as if it had been waiting. "IMSTILLHERE. Jess and I locked eyes, the joke drained from both of us. The air felt colder suddenly, and I swear the flames of the candles flickered, as if disturbed by some unseen breath. Before we could say anything else, a soft knock came from somewhere above us, from the direction of the attic. The knock echoed through the silence like a gunshot. Jess's eyes darted up to the ceiling, wide and glossy, as if she was trying to see through the plaster and beams. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. The air felt thick, heavier than before, as if the room itself was holding its breath. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, but it wasn't really a question. We both heard it. We both knew it came from the attic. "Maybe it's just the wind," I said, though my voice cracked, betraying the lie. The logical side of me screamed that it was just an old house settling, a branch brushing too hard against the siding. But there was nothing logical about the way my skin prickled, or how every instinct told me not to go up there. Jess bit her lip, her fingers still hovering over the planchette, as if it might jump back to life at any second. The candles flickered again, casting quick, jittery shadows that made it look like the walls were shifting. "We need to check," she said, forcing a bravado I knew she didn't feel. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and stood up. My legs felt like they were made of rubber. Every creak of the floorboards, beneath my weight, seemed to echo tenfold, each step an unwelcome announcement that we were moving. Jess followed close behind, the Ouija board abandoned on the floor, its letters staring up at us like an accusation. The attic door was in the hallway, just past the old grandfather clock that came with the house. It was one of those pull-down types, with a ladder that unfolded, the kind you only see in old movies where things go horribly wrong. I reached up, fingers brushing the cord, and for a moment I thought about stopping, turning around and pretending we hadn't heard anything at all. but Jess placed a hand on my arm, her touch grounding me, even if it was ice cold. "We've got this," she said, more to herself than to me. I pulled. The ladder creaked and groaned as it unfurled, sending a shiver down my spine. The attic yawned open, dark and stale, with that familiar old wood smell, mixed with something else, something sour and metallic. Jess turned on her phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick darkness like a knife. "Go ahead," she whispered, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, that she wanted me to go first. With every step up, the air grew colder, biting at my skin. My head breached the attic's entrance, and the beam of light swept across boxes covered in yellowed sheets, an old rocking chair in the corner, and dust motes swirling like tiny ghosts. Nothing seemed out of place, but that didn't mean anything. "Anything?" Jess called from below. "No," I said, though the word tasted wrong. I stepped fully into the attic, the floor creaking underfoot, and moved the light around again. That's when I saw it. In the far corner, just past the rocking chair, something glinted back at me. I approached, my heart pounding so loud I half expected Jess to tell me to quiet down. It was a mirror, tall and ornate, with a frame carved in swirling patterns that reminded me of vines. The surface was cracked, spiderwebbing out from the center like a frozen explosion. But it wasn't the mirror itself that made me pause. It was the faint outline of a handprint smeared across the glass, too large to be either mine or Jess's. Before I could say anything, another sound broke the silence. A dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, and it was coming from right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam whipping wildly, landing on nothing, just boxes and shadows. "Jess, get up here," I said, my voice thin and shaky, but she didn't respond. The silence below was deafening. I scrambled to the attic entrance, peering down, and felt my stomach drop. The living room below was dark. The candles had gone out, leaving only the thin sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. Jess was gone. "Jess!" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. And then, just as I was about to climb down, I saw the Ouija board, still on the floor where we'd left it. But now, the planchette had moved, settled firmly on one word. "Goodbye." Panic clawed at my chest as I stared down at the Ouija board. The word goodbye sat there, mocking me with its simplicity. Jess was nowhere in sight, and the silence pressed down around me like a suffocating blanket. The only sound was the faint rustle of the trees outside, their branches scraping against the house like skeletal fingers. I climbed down the attic ladder as quickly as my shaky legs allowed, my flashlight beam bouncing across the walls. "Jess!" I called again, louder this time, my voice cracking with desperation. The silence persisted. I swept the light around the living room, half expecting to see her crouched in a corner, grinning at me, ready to yell, "Gotcha!" But the room was empty, the shadows stretching and shifting, like they had a life of their own. I took a step forward and winced as the floorboard groaned underfoot. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It came from the hallway that led to the kitchen and the basement door, a place that was now draped in darkness. The whisper wasn't a word, not really, but a sound that sent goosebumps racing up my arms. I hesitated, my breath hitching as I listened. Then it came again, louder this time, like a voice pressing against my ear. "Come here." "Jess!" I whispered, more a plea than a question. The flashlight beam trembled in my grip as I edged toward the hallway, the shadows thickening with every step. I glanced at the basement door, its chipped paint and rusted hinges giving it a sinister edge. We hadn't even opened it since moving in. The realtor had mentioned it was just storage, damp and cramped, and we'd decided there was enough space in the attic. The whisper came again, this time followed by a light scraping noise, like nails running down wood. My heart hammered in my chest, my pulse pounding in my ears so loud it almost drowned out the sound. "Jess, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the dark swallowing the light from my phone before it could touch the walls. Then, just as I was about to turn around, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow slid across the floor, moving with purpose, heading straight for the basement door. My breath caught in my throat as the door creaked open just an inch, enough for the darkness inside to spill out like ink. A chill swept over me, making my skin prickle. "Jess!" I whispered again, but this time it was more like a prayer. The door shuddered, and before I could react, it creaked open wider, revealing a staircase descending into the pitch black. My flashlight flickered, the beams sputtering as if it were protesting the sight. "Come here," the whisper called again, clearer now, more insistent. It wasn't Jess. The voice was wrong, deeper, almost metallic, with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I took a step back, the urge to run surging through me, but my legs felt anchored to the floor. A shape began to emerge at the top of the basement stairs. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent in angles that made my stomach lurch. Its face, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a hollow, dark expanse. The shadows around it seemed to shift and ripple, like they were alive, feeding off the fear that crackled in the air. My flashlight blinked out, plunging me into darkness. A sudden noise shattered the silence, a crash from the kitchen. The lights flickered on and off, giving me flashes of the room bathed in harsh, unnatural light. For a split second, I thought I saw Jess, her eyes wide with terror, standing in the doorway, with her mouth open as if screaming. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the light went out again. "No!" I whispered, stumbling backward. The basement door slammed shut with a force that made the walls shudder. The silence returned, more oppressive than before, and in the darkness I could feel the shadows pressing closer, their presence cold and suffocating. Somewhere in the house, hidden by the black, I heard that voice again, softer now, almost amused. "I'm still here." I stood frozen in the dark, heart thudding so hard it felt like it might crack a rib. The silence that followed was worse than the whisper, heavy, smothering, pressing down on me like a weight. My phone flashlight sputtered back to life with a weak, erratic glow, and I swept it around the hallway, half expecting to see that twisted shadow lurking in the corner. But the hallway was empty. "Jess!" I choked out, my voice barely more than a rasp. The last image of her, wide-eyed and terrified, flashed through my mind. I forced myself to move, each step forward taking more willpower than I thought I had. I edged past the basement door, daring it to open again, before slipping into the kitchen where the crash had come from. The room was a mess, drawers flung open, cutlery scattered across the linoleum floor. One of the cabinets hung loose on a single hinge, swinging back and forth like a broken limb, but there was no sign of Jess. "Please," I whispered to the emptiness, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt like a kid again, that helpless, sinking feeling you get when you lose sight of your parents in a crowded store. Then I noticed something strange. On the table, where our half-unpacked boxes of dishes had been, lay the old Ouija board. It was sitting perfectly centered, the planchette back on it, pointing to a single word: help. I backed away, bumping into the counter so hard a stack of plates rattled and threatened to fall. My hands were shaking, but I reached for the board, fighting the impulse to fling it across the room. There had to be a clue, something that could explain this nightmare. I placed my fingers on the planchette, swallowing my fear. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of the question. For a second, nothing happened. The kitchen was deathly silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move, dragging my trembling fingers along with it. B-A-S-E-M-E-N-T. A chill raced up my spine, my body locking up as if I'd been plunged into ice water. The basement, of course, the place we'd been avoiding since we moved in. The place that now felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me. A sudden noise behind me made me jump, the sound of something scraping across the floor. I spun around, heart in my throat, and saw the chair at the far end of the room slide an inch, then stop. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the walls themselves were watching, leaning in. "I'm coming," I muttered, forcing myself to believe the words. I turned and walked back toward the hallway, where the basement door loomed, more menacing now in the thin sliver of moonlight that managed to sneak through the curtains. The knob felt cold and slick under my palm as I twisted it. The door creaked open, revealing the staircase leading down into an abyss that smelled of damp earth and something metallic, something that made my stomach twist. I flicked my phone's flashlight on again, the weak beam struggling to pierce the darkness. "Jess!" I called out, my voice swallowed by the void. No answer, only the muffled drip of water somewhere below. I took the first step, the wood groaning beneath my weight. Then another, darkness at the bottom seeming to shift, like something was moving just out of sight. The air grew colder, each breath visible in front of me. Halfway down, the sound of a faint sob drifted up to me, small and broken. "Jess!" My heart leapt. It was her. It had to be. I rushed down the last steps, the flashlight jittering wildly. The basement was larger than I remembered, lined with old, rotting shelves and boxes that threatened to spill over. In the centre of the room was Jess, sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes wide with something far beyond fear. "What happened? Are you okay?" I moved toward her, but she shook her head, eyes darting past me to the shadowy corners of the room. "It's not just us," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We're not alone." Before I could respond, the basement door above slammed shut, the echo reverberating through the room. And then the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and tangled, surrounding us like a net. "I'm still here," they said, over and over, until the words felt like they were seeping into my skin. The whispers surrounded us, weaving through the cold, damp air like tendrils. Each breath I took was shallow, ragged, laced with the metallic tang of fear. Jess sat motionless, eyes wide and locked on something I couldn't see, something lurking in the shadow-drenched corners of the basement. My phone's flashlight cast a trembling glow, its beam barely cutting through the dark. "Jess, we have to go," I said, my voice a strained whisper. I reached out, but she flinched back, shaking her head. "It's here," she said, her voice cracked and barely audible. Her eyes darted to the far corner, where the darkness seemed almost solid, like it was pulsing, breathing. A sudden shuffling sound made my blood run cold. It was the sound of movement, deliberate and slow, accompanied by the faint scrape of nails against concrete. The beam of my flashlight wavered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shape, tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that moved like they were held by invisible strings. "We need to go," I said again, this time louder, hoping it would drown out the whispers that pressed against my skull. I grabbed Jess's arm, pulling her to her feet. She stumbled but didn't resist. The shadows seemed to close in, following our movements as we backed toward the stairs. A low, guttural sound, almost like a chuckle, rumbled from the darkness. It felt like ice water trickling down my spine, freezing me in place. "You'll never leave," the voice said, deep and guttural, reverberating through the walls. Jess's grip tightened on my arm, nails digging into my skin. "Run," she whispered. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted up the stairs, the old wood groaning under our frantic footsteps. Behind us, the sound of scraping and that low, inhuman laughter chased us like a storm. We burst into the hallway, gasping for air as the basement door slammed shut behind us, rattling the walls. For a moment, we stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open or splinter apart. But nothing happened. The house fell into silence, a silence so thick it felt alive. "What is happening?" Jess whispered, tears streaking her face. I looked at her, realizing she already knew. The Ouija board, the whispers, the shape in the shadows. This wasn't just an old house, with creaking floorboards and drafty rooms. It was a trap. I reached for her hand and led her back to the living room, where the Ouija board still lay, now with the planchette placed in the center. The word "help" had been replaced. Now it spelled out something else. "Welcome." "We need to end this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I placed my fingers on the planchette, and Jess did the same, her touch trembling. What do you want?" I asked, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. The planchette moved immediately, faster than before, dragging our fingers across the board in sharp, jerky motions. "STAY." The room darkened as if a shadow had fallen over it, and the whispers returned, louder, overlapping, and chaotic. The air grew colder, and for a moment, I thought I saw figures standing at the edge of the room, watching, waiting. "We can't," Jess said, tears streaming down her face. We won't." The board quivered under our touch, and the planchette moved again. "YOUCANTLEAVE." Something snapped inside me, an instinct driven by pure terror and defiance. I grabbed the board and hurled it across the room, where it struck the wall and shattered into splinters. The whispers cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Jess and I stood there, hearts pounding, staring at the broken pieces of wood scattered across the floor. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the oppressive feeling lifted. The air felt lighter, the room warmer. The shadows that had crept along the walls seemed to recede, retreating back into the corners where they belonged. We didn't sleep that night. We sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, listening for any hint of the whispers returning, watching the first light of dawn spill into the room. By morning, we packed what we could and left the house behind, leaving the shattered remains of the Ouija board and the memories of that night locked inside. We never spoke of it again, but sometimes, when the wind is just right or the night too quiet, I can still hear it, that voice, low and amused, whispering from somewhere deep in the dark. I'm still here. The Ouija board told me to dig in my backyard. I found something I wish I hadn't. If you're reading this, don't make the same mistake I did. It's funny, looking back, how a stupid game at a friend's house turned into a nightmare that swallowed up my entire life. It started on a typical Friday night. Me, Nate, and Kelly were hanging out in Nate's basement, the usual spot for bad ideas and cheap thrills. We were bored out of our minds, so when Nate pulled out an old Ouija board he said he found in his attic. Kelly rolled her eyes, but I couldn't help but feel a shiver of excitement. "You're not serious, right?" Kelly asked, crossing her arms. She was the cautious one, always looking out for us. Nate, on the other hand, was all about proving he wasn't afraid of anything. "Come on, what's the worst that could happen?" Nate smirked, plopping the board down in the middle of the old coffee table. Dust puffed up like it was disturbed from a century of sleep, adding to the already tense atmosphere. I'd always heard stories about these things, cousin's friend of a friend stuff, but I never believed them. I'm not superstitious. I don't even believe in ghosts, or at least I didn't. We lit a few candles to set the mood, though it was more for laughs than anything else. I swear I could almost hear Kelly's eyes rolling as we placed our fingers on the planchette. The first few minutes were filled with giggles and mock seriousness, as Nate asked ridiculous questions like, "Who's the hottest guy in this room?" He wasn't prepared for Kelly to answer, "No one," without hesitation. But then things changed. The jokes stopped when I decided to ask something different, something that felt too real the second it left my mouth. "Is there anything in this house that we should know about?" I half expected Kelly to push the planchette as a prank, but it started to move slowly, deliberately. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. Our fingertips were barely touching it. The muscles in my arms felt tense, like they were trying to pull back, but couldn't. D-I-G, it spelled out. We stared at the board, the single word sinking into the silence that followed. "Dig," Nate finally said, the bravado in his voice cracking like ice. Before we could react, the planchette moved again. Faster? This time. B-A-C-K-Y-A-R-D dot. My heart thudded so loud, I was sure the others could hear it. Kelly backed away, shaking her head. "No, this is too messed up," she said, standing up so fast that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I'm out," but I was locked in place, staring at the board. The room felt colder, like the candles were pulling warmth from the air instead of giving it. "Guys," I whispered, breaking the silence that had swallowed us. "What if there's something actually buried out there?" Nate, being Nate, grinned as he pushed away the board. "Let's find out," he said, grabbing the flashlight from the shelf. Kelly shot him a glare, but didn't try to stop us. She just watched as we bundled up against the night's chill and stepped into the darkness of Nate's yard. We stood there, the backyard stretching out into the woods behind the house like an ink stain. The air was damp, a mixture of wet grass and the metallic tang of soil. Nate handed me the flashlight while he dug through the shed for a spade. Every sound seemed magnified, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, even our shaky breathing. "Found it," Nate called, holding up an old rusty spade. He shoved it into the soft earth near the tree line, the squelch echoing louder than I thought possible. The digging started as a joke, but as the minutes passed, we fell silent, the tension thickening like a fog. After what felt like an eternity, Nate's spade hit something hard. We exchanged looks in the dim light. He reached down and scraped away the dirt with his hands, revealing an old wooden box, the corners rotted and splintered. "Dude," he breathed, eyes wide. "What is this?" A gust of wind blew through the trees, and for a second, I thought I heard a whisper, soft and slithery, weaving through the leaves. I wanted to tell Nate to stop, that we should cover it up and go back inside, but curiosity, that damned itch, held me there, watching as he pried the lid open. Inside was a bundle, wrapped in a piece of old yellowed cloth. The smell hit us first, musty, like damp wood and something sour. My throat tightened as Nate unwrapped it, revealing what looked like an old diary and a small tarnished locket. The cover of the diary was cracked leather, faded to a sickly brown, with no name on it. "It's just a diary," Nate said, forcing a laugh that didn't match the unease in his eyes. "Guess we're done here." But deep down, I knew we weren't. I reached out to pick up the diary and the wind rose again, stronger this time, making the pages flutter open on their own. The writing was spidery, uneven, as though written in haste, and that's when I read the first line that would haunt me for nights to come. "If you're reading this, it's already too late. I wish I could tell you that we left that box alone, buried it back in the earth, and pretended we never saw it, but we didn't. That diary, its cracked leather and faded, frantic handwriting, had hooked its claws into me. I couldn't shake the feeling that opening it had already changed something. Back inside Nate's basement, the mood was different. The laughter and banter from earlier had been replaced by a heavy silence. Even Kelly, who normally brushed off our stupid antics, sat on the edge of the couch with her arms wrapped around herself, eyes darting between the flickering shadows. "Maybe we should just burn it," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "What?" "No way," Nate said, trying to sound confident, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "It's probably just some old diary from a kid who used to live here. Maybe we'll find some creepy stories or something." "Yeah," I added, though my voice was more of a whisper. "Just stories." With a deep breath, I flipped open the diary. The first few pages were filled with what looked like innocent entries about the weather, chores, and family. But the handwriting changed about a quarter of the way in. The lines grew jagged, almost erratic, as if the writer had been in a rush or scared. "Something is in the woods. I hear it at night whispering my name. I told Papa, but he said it's just the wind. It's not the wind." Nate let out a low whistle, but he didn't say anything. I kept reading, my fingers tracing the words, as if that would somehow make sense of them. Last night, the whispering was louder, closer. It told me to dig. "I think it's under the old tree. I'm scared. What if it finds me first?" The room seemed to darken with every word I read. The shadows thrown by the candles stretched and twisted on the walls, flickering as if something unseen moved just beyond the light's reach. Kelly stood up abruptly, her chair toppling over behind her. "I'm done," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't care what you two do, but I'm not staying here." She made for the stairs, but before she could take more than 2 steps, a sound stopped her. A low, scraping noise, like nails dragging across wood. It came from outside, from the direction of the yard. Nate and I exchanged wide-eyed looks. He grabbed the flashlight, his knuckles turning white around the handle. "It's probably just a raccoon," he muttered, more to convince himself than anyone else. But we all knew that noise hadn't come from an animal. It was too deliberate, too slow. "Stay here," I told Kelly, but she was already backing into the farthest corner of the room, her eyes locked on the small, ground-level window that faced the backyard. Nate and I moved closer to the window, every step feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The flashlight beam shook as he directed it outside. The yard was empty, or so it seemed at first. But then I saw it. A shadow moved, just at the edge of the woods, slithering between the trees. It wasn't the shadow of an animal or a person. It was too thin, too elongated, almost liquid in the way it shifted. My breath caught in my throat as it stopped and seemed to turn towards the house. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Nate didn't respond, but I felt him stiffen beside me. The shadow moved again, vanishing behind the largest tree, the same one where we'd found the box. "We need to put it back," Kelly said, almost sobbing. "We need to put it back right now." But before we could react, The basement lights flickered, and then the candles, every single one, blew out all at once. The darkness that followed was suffocating, pressing in on us from every side. And that's when we heard it. A soft, almost playful whisper drifting through the room. Dig. The silence that followed that whisper was so deep, it felt like the world had stopped breathing. My heart pounded against my ribs, and I could feel the adrenaline slicing through my veins like ice. The darkness was almost tangible, pressing down on us with an oppressive weight. "Nate," I croaked, barely managing to find my voice. "Turn the flashlight back on." His fingers fumbled with the switch, the plastic slipping in his sweaty grip. The beam of light finally sputtered to life, slicing through the dark and casting wild, jittery shadows on the walls. But the whisper had left something behind, an aftertaste of fear, sharp and bitter. Kelly was crying softly in the corner, her eyes squeezed shut like she could block out whatever was happening by refusing to look. "We need to get rid of that box," she said, between gasps, her voice shaking as much as the flashlight in Nate's hand. "No," Nate said, surprising us both with the firmness in his voice. "We need to know what's going on first. We can't just bury it and hope it goes away." Before I could argue, a new sound prickled at my ears. A faint scratching coming from beneath us. I glanced down, my breath hitching as the noise grew louder, more frantic, like something, or someone, was clawing at the floorboards. The diary on the table suddenly flipped open, pages rustling as if caught in a breeze we couldn't feel. My pulse roared in my ears as the same jagged handwriting scrawled itself across an empty page, right in front of our eyes. D-I-G. This time, it wasn't just a command. It felt like a threat. "All right," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Let's take this thing back outside. Now." Nate nodded, the bravado from earlier completely gone. He grabbed the box and wrapped the diary back in the cloth. But as soon as he lifted it, the scratching stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse, stretching out like a taut wire ready to snap. We hurried up the stairs, each step creaking beneath our weight. Kelly followed, clutching her phone like a lifeline, her knuckles white. We stepped into the backyard, the cold night air hitting us like a slap. The wind had picked up, rattling the trees with a hollow, mournful sound. Nate dropped the box near the hole we dug earlier and handed me the spade. "Bury it," he whispered, eyes darting nervously to the woods. I dug fast, the earth damp and heavy. Each scoop felt like it was fighting me, clinging to the blade as if trying to hold the box back. Kelly's flashlight swept across the yard, her breathing ragged as she scanned for any movement. And then we heard it again. The whisper, but this time it wasn't playful. It was angry. Too late. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the night itself was speaking. Nate took a step back, his eyes wide and wild. "We shouldn't have opened it," Kelly whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "Oh God, we shouldn't have opened it." Before we could react, the ground beneath us shifted, a subtle tremor that sent vibrations up through my boots. The air grew colder, biting through my jacket and skin, chilling me to the bone. And then, as if summoned, a shadow began to unfurl from the base of the tree, rising slowly, deliberately. It wasn't just a trick of the light. This thing had substance, its form darker than the night, almost glistening like oil. I stepped back, the spade slipping from my numb fingers as the shadow reached out, tendrils extending toward the box. My brain screamed at me to run, but my body felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot as the shadow touched the diary. The whispers exploded in volume, an angry cacophony that surged through the air. "You woke us," it hissed, the voice layered, dozens of whispers weaving into one. Nate stumbled backward, tripping over a rock and falling hard onto the ground. Kelly screamed, finally breaking the paralysis that gripped us. I snapped out of it just in time to see the shadow curl around the box, dragging it into the earth. The diary was the last thing to disappear, its pages fluttering as if in protest before being swallowed by the dark. Then, just like that, everything stopped. The wind died down, the whispers ceased, and the air warmed ever so slightly. The three of us stood there, breathing hard, the silence pressing in once more. But it wasn't the same silence. It felt watchful, waiting. "We need to leave," I finally said, my voice hoarse. Without another word, we bolted back into the house, slamming the door behind us as if it could keep out whatever we'd just disturbed. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The silence in Nate's basement was suffocating. We sat in a tense circle, the adrenaline still pumping through our veins, but none of us dared to speak. The dim light from the overhead bulb did little to chase away the creeping darkness that seemed to cling to every corner. Kelly's eyes were red-rimmed, and she kept glancing at the small, ground-level window, as if expecting to see something watching from outside. "Did you see the way it moved?" Nate's voice cracked as he broke the silence. He was staring at his hands, dirt crusted under his nails from digging, but I could tell he wasn't really seeing them. He was replaying what we'd just witnessed, same as me. "It took the box," Kelly whispered, as if saying it out loud might invite the shadow back. "But why did it say it's too late?" Her voice trembled on the last words. I didn't have an answer, and that scared me more than anything. I glanced at the table where the diary had sat only minutes ago. The memory of those spidery letters seared into my mind. The silence stretched, heavy with questions none of us wanted to voice. A sudden knock at the door upstairs jolted all three of us. Kelly let out a small yelp, and Nate's eyes shot to the ceiling wide with fear. No one moved. The knock came again, this time more insistent. The tension wound tighter, coiling in my chest like a living thing. "Who the hell is that?" I managed to say, my voice a strained whisper. "Stay here," Nate said, grabbing the flashlight even though the house lights were on. He climbed the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. Kelly and I exchanged glances, too afraid to follow, but too terrified to stay put. We heard the faint sound of the front door creaking open. "Hello?" Nate's voice called out, wavering. Silence. Seconds ticked by, stretching into what felt like hours. Then we heard it, a low, raspy breath, like someone exhaling through clenched teeth. Kelly's eyes went wide, and she grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. The breath turned into a whisper, the same voice we'd heard outside, but clearer now, too clear. "Dig deeper." I sprang up before I realized what I was doing, my legs carrying me to the base of the stairs. Nate was standing frozen at the open door. The flashlight beam pointed out into the empty yard. There was no one there. But as I stepped closer, I saw what had paralyzed him. Scrawled in dark, muddy letters across the porch floor were the same words. "Dig deeper." "Close it! Close the door!" Kelly shouted, finally snapping out of her daze. Nate slammed the door shut, bolting it for good measure. We stood in the hallway, the silence pressing in again, suffocating. "This isn't happening," Nate muttered, pacing back and forth. It's not happening." But it was. I knew it was, and something in my gut told me we hadn't seen the worst of it yet. What did it mean, dig deeper? Kelly's voice was thin, almost breaking. I didn't want to find out. But I didn't get the choice. The lights flickered again, dimming until they were barely more than a soft glow. The basement door, which had been left ajar, creaked open wider. Cold air swept up from the darkness below, carrying with it a scent that made my stomach twist. damp earth, and something else, something metallic. "We should go," I said, my voice more forceful now. "We need to get out of here." But before we could move, a deep thud echoed from beneath the floor, as if something heavy had fallen. Nate froze mid-step, eyes locked on the basement door. The thud came again, rhythmic, like a heartbeat pounding from under the house. Kelly whimpered, backing up against the wall. "We need to leave now," she repeated, this time with the desperation of someone on the edge of panic. And then it spoke again, the voice drifting up from the basement, unmistakable and taunting. "You haven't found it yet." Every hair on my body stood on end. The room was so quiet, I could hear my pulse drumming in my ears. Without thinking, I reached for the spade that Nate had dropped near the front door. We had to do something, anything, to end this. But as I turned back toward the basement, I realized with a sinking dread that whatever had been unleashed wasn't going to let us go that easily. The walls seemed to shudder, the thudding beneath us growing louder. And for the first time, I knew that digging had only been the start of our nightmare. Whatever we'd stirred from its slumber wanted more, and it wouldn't stop until we gave it what it was searching for. The pounding under the floor grew louder, each thud reverberating through my bones. The flashlight beam shook in my hands as I took a step toward the basement door. Kelly's sobs were the only other sound in the room, a reminder that whatever courage I had left needed to count for something. "Don't go down there," she whispered, voice cracked and raw. But it wasn't a choice anymore. I needed to know what we had awakened and how to stop it. Nate's face was pale, eyes locked onto mine as he handed me the flashlight without a word. I pushed the basement door open wider, the cold air rushing up to greet me, and took the first step down. The stairs groaned under my weight, each creak echoing into the dark below. The flashlight cast a narrow beam, slicing through the gloom and revealing a path that seemed longer than I remembered. The basement was colder than before, as if the earth itself was exhaling frost. I reached the bottom step and hesitated. The walls were covered in streaks of dirt and something darker, almost oily, that glistened in the light. The thudding had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic rasp, like breathing. "Nate," I called softly, hoping the sound of my own voice would anchor me. He was just a shadow at the top of the stairs, eyes wide and unblinking. Something caught my eye. A disturbance in the middle of the basement floor. It looked like the dirt had been pushed up from beneath, forming a small mound. My pulse quickened as I stepped closer. The air grew thick, making each breath feel like I was inhaling smoke. I reached the mound and knelt, pressing my free hand against the cold, packed soil. Without warning, the earth shifted, sinking beneath my palm. I fell back, heart racing, as a thin, bony hand broke through the surface, its fingers impossibly long and blackened, clawing for the open air. "Oh God!" Nate's voice cracked from above, but I couldn't look away. The hand was followed by an arm, and then the head of something that shouldn't exist. Its skin was stretched tight over its skull, eyes sunken hollows that seemed to drink in the light and extinguish it. The thing pulled itself up, inch by agonizing inch, until it stood hunched and trembling in the middle of the room. Its body was covered in the same oily substance that stained the walls, and its chest rose and fell in jagged, irregular gasps. "Why did you wake me?" The voice wasn't a whisper now. It was a ragged, layered chorus, as if multiple voices were speaking through cracked, dry throats. My voice failed me, throat seizing up as the thing took a shuffling step forward. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the cold, inhuman gaze that seemed to pierce through me. "It's not us!" Nate shouted, finally breaking through the wall of fear. "We didn't mean to!" The creature's head snapped toward him, and for a moment, the basement was so silent that I thought my heart had stopped. Then, with a horrifying speed, it lunged. I watched in shock as it passed through me like a shadow, ice spreading through my chest, as if my blood had turned to frost. I spun around in time to see it latch onto Nate, its skeletal arms wrapping around him like a grotesque embrace. His scream cut through the silence, raw and primal as he thrashed against the thing. But it was too late. It sank back into the earth, dragging him down with it. No! Kelly's voice was a broken wail as she stumbled down the stairs. She reached the spot where Nate had vanished and clawed at the dirt, tears streaming down her face. I fell to my knees beside her, but the earth was solid once more, as if it had never been disturbed. The silence that followed was deafening. The cold in the basement began to fade, replaced by a stifling heat that made my skin prickle. Kelly's breathing was ragged, sobs shaking her shoulders as she whispered his name over and over. "We need to go," I said, my voice hollow. I pulled her to her feet, and we staggered up the stairs, leaving behind the remnants of our mistake. The night air felt suffocating as we stumbled outside, our steps faltering and disjointed. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, casting a pale glow over the yard. The tree where we had found the box stood like a silent sentinel, its branches swaying gently as if in mockery. I turned to look at Kelly, her face streaked with tears and dirt. There were no words left to say. Whatever had happened, whatever we had woken, had claimed Nate. But deep down, as I watched the shadows linger beneath the trees, I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over.